Today's Bible reading comes from Acts chapter 23, verses 12 to 35, and can be found in page 1120 in the Pew Bibles. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring to you this young man because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 men are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Charlie. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you, and good to be able to continue our series in Acts. I hope you've been enjoying the journey that we've been going on in Acts. I certainly have, and as you know, as we go through, every second week is reflection questions, every second passage in Acts, because otherwise it would be too much to go through, and we've certainly been enjoying that in our small group. In today's passage, we're really focusing on how God works through human plans, even through sinful human plans, even through plans where the actions of the people are disobedient to God. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of a Bob Dylan song. Some of you might know this song. I saw Ralph's ears prick up immediately there. This song is called "God on Our Side." I'm not going to attempt to sing it, but I will read verse 8 of this song. Bob Dylan writes, "Through many a dark hour, I've been thinking about this, that Jesus Christ was betrayed by a kiss. But I can't think for you. You'll have to decide whether Judas Iscariot had God on his side." Now, at first glance, it seems like a pretty obvious, easy question to answer. Obviously not. Obviously, Judas Iscariot did not have God on his side when he betrayed Jesus with a kiss. He was acting sinfully, wasn't he? In one gospel, it even says explicitly that as Judas went out at night to betray Jesus, Satan entered him. And yet at the same time, we know that Judas' betrayal of Jesus was this key step in God's plan, wasn't it, for Jesus to die on the cross. There's another place where the Apostle Peter tries to prevent Jesus from going to his death. And at that point, Jesus declares that Satan is influencing Peter, making it so clear that Jesus dying was part of God's plan. Which certainly leads Bob Dylan to wonder, did Judas then have God on his side when he went to betray Jesus? I'm not sure that's perhaps the best question to ask, but what becomes very clear through even this example, this extreme example of Judas' betrayal of Jesus, is that God was in control. And we see this in today's text. God is in control even through sinful human plans, even through human plans that are disobedient to God. Let's have a look where we are today. Paul's finished his 3 missionary journeys through Turkey, Macedonia and Greece, and he's back in Jerusalem. And we've had a very quick last few days in Paul's life over the last few passages. A lot has happened. Day 1, Paul's in the Jerusalem temple and he's attacked by a Jewish mob. He's arrested by the Romans, partly for his safety. And Paul's on the steps and he speaks to the crowd. They are furious. He's taken into the barracks by the Romans for the night. And the Roman commander, he wants more information. So he arranges a meeting of the Sanhedrin. You might have looked at this meeting during small groups or during the week. A meeting of the Jewish ruling council. This is day 2. He meets with the council. It's all happening just sequentially. Day 2, he appears before the Sanhedrin, and due to a few things Paul says, the Pharisees and the Sadducees get pretty angry at each other. And again, the Roman commander, he's concerned for Paul's safety, so he takes him back to the barracks for the night. And it's there that Jesus appears to him. And actually, that night, Jesus encourages him that he will go to Rome. He will go to Rome. And that's something that Paul's wanted to do for a little while now. Back in chapter 19, he initially said, I want to get myself to Rome. That's day 2. Today's passage is day 3. Not a lot of time has passed since he first appeared as a free man on the temple steps. Today, in day 3, we see very clearly the plans and desires of different groups. And as we look at these, we're going to see how God works his purposes out, even though some of these plans are very much opposed to God. The first group we meet are some Jewish opponents of Paul who have a very clear plan. They want Paul dead. This is what we read. Next morning, so the morning of the 3rd day, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they'd killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we've taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here. Who are these 40 plus Jewish people who want Paul dead? Well, after that Sanhedrin meeting the day before, they're probably Sadducees. They were kind of the most angry at Paul after that meeting. And there's a few interesting things here. You see, they take an oath not to eat or drink until Paul's dead. They're very serious about this plan, but they also expected it to be over pretty quick. They didn't think it would take very long. And the fact they form a plot as well, this sort of came to me through the week, it seems to show they didn't have any faith in the Roman legal system delivering what they wanted. Maybe they were worried about bias. Paul was a Roman citizen. Maybe they thought, the Romans, they're going to look after him. Maybe they realised they just didn't have a good case. Really, when it went to a hearing, they didn't have a very strong case against Paul. The other thing that's interesting here is they tell the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They are not worried about these Jewish sort of pillars of society spilling the beans on their plot. They actually kind of involve them in their assassination plans. And the plan, of course, as you see, involves killing Paul in transit. This would be the easiest time to get Paul when he's moving from one place to another. Romans had pretty good security in the barracks. Following the previous day's Sanhedrin meeting where there was an uproar, they're going to be taking very good care of him at any gathering. But on the road, moving through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, that could be a great opportunity for the assassins to do their work. In short, we see very clearly here how badly they want him dead. They have had enough of this upstart Christian. They are frustrated that Paul, previously their hero, the hero of establishment, Jerusalem Judaism, is now the chief spokesperson for their enemy, the Christian movement. And so they want him dead. They hatch their plot. That is their plan. But they're not the only ones with plans and agendas. I'll keep reading. When the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. Initially we see the plan is thwarted, isn't it? Now, it's not super clear how Paul's nephew heard of this plan. I mean, he was definitely in the right place at the right time. But however it happened, God putting him there, he tells Paul, who gets the centurion to take him to the commander, and then the nephew of Paul tells the commander, who obviously takes him seriously. The commander's final comment is, "Don't tell anyone that you've told me this." He doesn't want the opponents of Paul to change their plans, which could, of course, mean they realise they've been rumbled and they adjust what they're doing. Now, at this point, the commander has probably, maybe received that request from the chief priests. You know, he's received a letter or something saying, "We'd love to meet again. Can you please bring Paul back before the Sanhedrin? Got a few more questions to ask him." He might have even been thinking what time would work best, which day should we do this, but he obviously puts his schedule aside. He takes the initiative. He says, "I've got to get Paul out of the city right away." So he gathers 470 soldiers, 200 swords, 200 spears, 70 horsemen. They plan to leave at 9 p.m, so 3 hours after sunset. Paul's pretty safe in the barracks in Jerusalem. That's a bit of a fortress for the Romans, but the commander knows there are now at least 40 assassins out there on the streets of Jerusalem, desperate to kill this guy. And he says, "We've got to get him out of the city. Got to get him somewhere safer." Caesarea is a very good choice. Caesarea is an outpost in northern Israel. You can probably see it up there against the coast of the Mediterranean. It's a good distance from Jerusalem, and it's a Roman outpost. A lot of soldiers there, easy to keep someone safe in Caesarea. So he organises this travel to get Paul out under cover of darkness with essentially a small army, really. 470 soldiers would have been pretty powerful force just walking through the streets. And he writes a letter. I'll read this out. "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man," it's referring to Paul, "this man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." We finally get a name for this commander who's been around for a few chapters, Claudius Lysias. And he was the ranking officer in Jerusalem, but he decides to escalate this case to Felix, the regional Roman governor based in Caesarea. Gives a short description. And you'll see he clearly thinks Paul should still face trial. There's due process to happen here. He would then, shortly after, I imagine, write to the Jewish accusers and say, "Please now bring your case north. You can meet in Caesarea." What do we see here about the commander? I think what we see is he wants to have a clear record. Lysias wants a clear record. Now, when you read this passage in Luke's account in Acts, he paints Lysias in a fairly positive light. Certainly, he's a man of law and order, isn't he, this commander? He's no nonsense. He protects Paul. He wants just and fair process. He's a loyal Roman soldier. That's all true. But there's a slant here. There's like an angle here he's got. See, in the letter, he paints himself as Paul's rescuer. It says, "I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen." Now, technically that's true, but it's not true in that order, is it? What happened was he saw the Jewish crowd attacking Paul. He arrested Paul before he knew he was a citizen, probably handled him pretty roughly. He actually thought he was an Egyptian rebel initially, someone they wanted to capture. Chained him up, got him ready to whip him at one stage, and interrogate him under torture. Didn't quite do it, and then he discovered he was a Roman citizen. And we actually read at that point that the commander was alarmed when he realised he'd put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Lysias at that point certainly was really shaking in his boots, thinking, oh boy, what have I done? I've overstepped the line with a Roman citizen here, treating him roughly without due process. And this would have been playing in his head, thinking, what's going to happen if Paul reports this to my superiors? What kind of trouble am I going to be in? And so his treatment of Paul, his letter to Felix, show that he's working really hard to make up for this earlier indiscretion. In his letter, he highlights how he cared for Paul, the Roman citizen. He followed due process. He certainly doesn't admit, his initial rough treatment of Paul. But he talks about himself as the rescuer of Paul, the hero of this story. And he also ensures the Jewish accusers, they can't blame him for bias too. He says, no, they still get to bring their case before him. It's just going to happen in Caesarea, where it's safer than Jerusalem. Is there anything wrong in what Lysias did? Is there anything sinister here? Look, probably not really. But like I said, I think there is a certain slant. There's an angle. He wants a clear record, doesn't he? He wants a clear record. He escalates Paul's case. He wants to keep him safe. And he wants to ensure nothing comes back to bite him afterwards. He wants a clear record, and he takes steps to make it happen. There's various competing priorities, aren't there? There's these 40-plus assassins. They want Paul dead. Commander Lysias, he wants a clear record. And now we see what the Roman Empire also wants. They want peace and order. That night, a group of almost 500 go on the road. They get about halfway to Caesarea, to Antipatris. You can see that's the route. Antipatris is just up there. About halfway they're done. They spend the night there, and it's pretty safe in the middle of Israel, quiet town. And so the next morning, all the foot soldiers, all 400 of them, come back to Jerusalem. The cavalry take him to Caesarea, hand Paul over formally. Presumably the horsemen return to Jerusalem as well. Felix learns a little bit about Paul, and then he says, we'll wait until the Jewish accusers come north, and we'll hear your case. Pretty uneventful really, but it's a great insight into the priorities of the Roman Empire at this time, which is to keep peace. To keep peace. The Roman Empire established what they called Pax Romana, or Roman peace is how it would be translated. A peace that's based on rule and law and force. Unlike lots of other barbaric lands, the Romans viewed themselves as very civilized, with courts and governors, process, chain of command. And the Pax Romana internally meant they didn't have to spend all their effort fighting internal wars. They could just focus on expanding their empire. It was quite a good strategy, really. Brutal, but effective. And Felix, his actions here, that reflects this desire for law and order. Receives the prisoner, takes him into custody, waits for the formal hearing. Think about the Jewish assassins. They're not interested in law and order. They're going to knife Paul on the street. Romans are not into that sort of thing. They're not into that sort of under cover of darkness assassinations. Someone's done the wrong thing, they'll go to court and they'll sit through it and there'll be a decision. We see this play out nicely in Paul's case. The Romans value peace and order, due process and legal systems. There's plenty of interest groups here. Jewish assassins wanting Paul dead, Commander Lysias trying to have a clear record, the Roman Empire wanting peace. But what actually happens? Well, what we'll see, and you'll see this in the next chapter, so a bit of a spoiler alert, but let me encourage you to read Acts 24 or go through the reflection questions this week. Paul gets to stand before a man he's never met before, a man of some clout, Governor Felix, a bunch of other dignitaries, and he gets to testify about Jesus Christ. He actually gets to speak to Felix about Jesus many times. We read this in the next chapter. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. He spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. I find that remarkable. The result of all these interest groups pushing their own agendas, trying to work out their own thing, is that the gospel of Jesus is shared with a completely new audience. That's the outcome. It's extraordinary, isn't it? None of those interested parties were seeking the spread of the gospel. They weren't interested in it, and yet that's the outcome. That is what happened. And it's because God is at work here. God's in control. God's at work to bring about Paul's witness for Jesus despite these human plans. In fact, he's at work through these human plans. He's at work through the Jewish assassin's plot, ensuring that Paul actually will now start his journey to Rome. He's not going to be staying in Jerusalem for much longer. He's at work through Paul's nephew hearing about it, ensuring that Paul's not murdered the next day on the street. He's at work through Commander Lysias's nervousness about his previous actions. You know, this guy's very keen to keep Paul safe now, making sure he gets transported safely. He's at work through the Roman Empire's desire for peace and order, meaning there will be these formal hearings. Paul will get to share about Jesus time and again. When I think of this passage, it's almost to me the dictionary definition of this wonderful verse in Proverbs you might know. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. God is in control despite and through human plans. This might be something you've sort of come across or thought about before, but there's some tricky questions to do with this concept, and I just want to address these very briefly. Firstly, this idea touches on that delicate interplay between God's sovereignty and human freedom. The Bible consistently holds these two things to be true, that God is sovereign. He is the king of the universe. God is in control, no matter how chaotic or out of control things look. God's never surprised. He's never caught off guard by things. And there's no actions that can thwart God's ultimate plans. But the Bible also holds that humans are given freedom, real freedom. Freedom to make choices, including the freedom to disobey God. And even the most sinful, unwise exercise of our God-given human freedom does not challenge God's ultimate control or thwart his eternal purposes. A lot of ink has obviously been spilled on how those two concepts sit together side by side, and different people will sort of pull the tension one way or the other. But the clear truth is both of these are true. God is sovereign and humans have freedom. Secondly, we see that God can work through human sin, but it is still sin. The reality of working through human plans, including human plans that are disobedient to God, is pretty extraordinary to think about, I think. Clearly, in our case today, that assassination plot of those Jewish opponents of Paul, that was a sinful plan to murder him on the street. And yet God worked through that. But the plot itself was still sinful, wasn't it? It was still disobedient to God. It was still a plot for murder. It's just that God worked through it. And this happens today as well. The clearest global example I can think of probably is persecution of Christians in many countries, including, say, in China. The tide of the Communist Party clamps down on Christian believers. Well, the more the gospel spreads, the more people come to trust in Jesus. It's hard to be super confident of the numbers, the figures, but a lot of graphs indicate a correlation between increased persecution and increased growth in faith in countries. Chinese people hear about the underground Christian movement and they're fascinated. They think, what's so amazing about this Jesus character that the government's so keen to suppress it? Chinese students who come to Australia, many of whom I know, are so interested to learn about this Western religion, as they'll call it. What is it that the leaders are so keen to stamp out? The persecution's taking place. That's still sinful, isn't it? It's still disobedient to God. It's still worthy of judgment. But it's just that God can work through this. God's plans still take place. At the start, I talked about Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus to death for personal gain. Perhaps the most incredible example of sin and disobedience to God, heartbreaking betrayal, which was used by God to bring about the most incredible, life-giving example of love and grace for all of humanity. But I think really the biggest example of all of this is probably our own. Because like dictators, like ancient Jewish assassins, even like Judas himself, all of us participate in sin. All of us turn away from God and do things that grieve God. We act selfishly, we disregard others, Maybe we act with cruelty and indifference. And just as much as Judas's sin, our sin is also responsible for Jesus going to the cross. Our sin is also used by God for his purposes. As Jesus dies in our place for our sake, we remember that it is our sin, our rejection of God's rule, that led to this taking place. But it's an outcome that God would use to provide for humanity a path back to relationship with God, and ultimately as well, a path to the defeat of evil. Yet just like for Judas, it is still sin. That's the wonderful and painful truth. God's purposes prevail even through my sin. And a third thing about this concept of God working even through human sin is that we don't always get to see God's purposes, but God is still in control. One of the pretty unique things about today's passage is that the time gap between the sinful actions and God's purposes coming to fruition is pretty quick, isn't it? I reckon Paul, even as he was on that night journey with those soldiers around him, he probably realised God was working out his plans. There he is. He's surrounded by Roman troops heading to a Roman outpost in the direction of Rome, where he always hoped to go, having just been encouraged by Jesus the night before. He could see God working through even a plot against his life. But that's rare, I think. That is rare that we see it that quickly. More often there is a long delay between some kind of human disobedient behaviour and seeing God's purposes through it. It can even be a delay of years. Sometimes we never get to see it. We don't actually see what God's purposes are in a particular instance. Sometimes all we see is the hurt and the pain caused by human action, and that's really hard. That can be devastating, really. As you know, there's 2 significant wars going on in the world right now. And as with all war, the root cause, if you get right to the bottom of it, is human sin. Evil and violence, rather than peace and love taking place. And God knows. God knows. God sees. God is a just judge. But it's hard to see what God's up to in those situations. It's hard to know what God's purpose will work out from these. That's really hard to know. Honestly, we may not know for years. We might never know. But it doesn't just apply for global examples either. For many here, you might have an example in your own life. Maybe something really close to home. Human decisions, human plans in people you know. Human sin, perhaps, which has resulted in grief and pain and loss. There's a pretty aching example in my own extended family at the moment, which is a source of pretty long-term pain and despair. And in many of these examples, including ours, maybe it's not clear what God's doing. What good purpose is God going to bring out of this? I've got no idea, and that's really hard. But we're reminded that God is in control. God is still sovereign, and his purposes work out. I want to see that. I want to see God's light shine through, but I don't always get to see it, do I? For us, let me encourage us to trust that God is still in control, even when we can't see it. Paul was buffeted around, wasn't he? When he travelled, he was buffeted around by different interest groups with their own purposes. We experience that too. We experience the effects of human sin, human plans. And just like God was in control with Paul, so God is in control in our world and our lives, working out his plans even through human sin. Let me pray. Lord God, we thank you today for the Apostle Paul and for his trust in you. Lord, even with all the pressures and plans that he faced. Lord, even today as we hear of the sinful actions of various types of groups, Lord, human plans, human purposes, Lord, affecting his life, we give you thanks for the insight we get in this passage to your purposes coming about. As just a few days later, Paul stood in front of Governor Felix and all his dignitaries and told them about the faith he has in Jesus Christ. Lord, how encouraging it is to see your plans and purposes work out even through human sinful action. Lord, for us today, regardless of what we're going through, what's happening in our lives, in our worlds, Lord, in many cases when we won't be able to see your plans, Lord, despite our desire for that clarity, I pray, Lord, you'd help us to trust in you, to trust that you're still in control. Lord, you haven't been caught off guard. Lord, you will work your purposes out, even if we don't get to see them, even if we don't get to see them soon. Lord, help us to have that deep faith in you that knows you are here for us, that even though many are the plans of people's hearts, Lord, you are the one who works out your purposes through them. Thank you for this encouragement. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to finish our service today with one final song, a song encouraging us